the silence in our house was a living thing. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the tense, airless quiet of a museum, a place where everything was for display and nothing was for touching. Tonight, it was heavier than usual, weighted down by the scent of roasted lamb and my father's expensive cologne. The dining room of our Baltimore home was a monument to my parents' aspirations, a stage set for a life they desperately wanted the world to see. Mahogany table polished to a dark mirror, crystal glasses that chimed with the nervous energy in the room, and on the far wall, the oil-painted portrait of my brother, Ethan. Always Ethan. He was the sun around which our family orbited, and I, his sister Maya, was the forgotten moon, only visible when his light permitted it. Tonight, he was blinding. He sat across from me, a conquering hero returned from the glittering battlefields of Silicon Valley. At 30, he had the kind of effortless charm that made people want to give him their money, their trust, their daughters. He was recounting, for the third time, the story of his latest funding round for his tech startup, Innovate. His hands carved the air as he spoke, painting a future of disruptive technology and billion-dollar valuations. My father, Richard, leaned forward, his face a mask of rapt attention. He saw his own ambition reflected in his son, amplified and perfected. He told Ethan that he was the living embodiment of the family legacy, a builder of empires. My mother, Caroline, watched him with an adoration that bordered on worship. Her smile was a fixture, a carefully maintained facade of maternal pride. She refilled Ethan's wine glass, her movements fluid and practiced, and remarked that he was not just building a company, but securing their future. I sat in my chair, feeling my own achievement shrinking in my chest until it was a hard, cold pebble. I had news, too. News that, in my small academic world, was seismic. After years of meticulous research and grant applications, I had finally secured funding from the National Archives to restore a collection of forgotten historical documents, the personal diaries, and ledgers of textile workers from Baltimore's industrial age. It was my life's passion, giving a voice to the voiceless, piecing together history from the margins. I had rehearsed the announcement in my head all day. I would wait for a lull in the conversation, clear my throat, and share my success. I imagined a flicker of pride in their eyes, a simple acknowledgement that their daughter, the quiet historian, had also accomplished something of value. The lull came. Ethan paused to take a dramatic sip of wine. This was my chance. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened my mouth. I started to explain, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous room. I told them about the grant, the significance of the documents, the recognition it represented in my field. For a moment, there was only the sound of my father chewing. He swallowed, took a sip of water, and then looked, not at me, but at Ethan. He said that was nice, dear, but real history was made in boardrooms, not dusty basements. My mother was less subtle. She gave me a tight, pitying smile. She told me it was a lovely little hobby, but she wondered when I was going to find a real job. She pointed her fork at Ethan, her voice rising with evangelical fervor, telling me to look at my brother. He was changing the world, she said. While I was playing with old paper, the pebble in my chest turned to ice. It wasn't just dismissal, it was erasure. In their eyes, my work wasn't just less important, it was worthless, a quaint diversion from the real business of life, which was the accumulation of wealth and status. Ethan, to his credit, tried to offer a crumb of support. He said it sounded cool, in a nerdy sort of way. But the damage was done. The conversation immediately pivoted back to him, to his new office, his upcoming feature in a business magazine, his plans to acquire a smaller company. I retreated back into my silence, the unspoken words souring in my mouth. I looked around the room, truly seeing it for the first time, not as my home, but as their shrine. Every mantelpiece, every wall, was a testament to Ethan. Photos of him winning his first sailing trophy, his university graduation portrait, him shaking hands with the governor. My own accolades were relegated to a dusty box in the attic debate team medals, academic certificates, a published paper in a historical journal. My mother had once explained that they didn't want to clutter the house with school things. But Ethan's entire life was on display. Each moment a carefully curated exhibit of success. I excused myself from the table, the lie of a headache feeling more like a prophecy. In the hallway, I steadied myself against the wall, the chill of the plaster seeping through my sweater. This was my life. A constant low-grade humiliation. A quiet battle for air in a room where someone else was consuming all the oxygen. I had spent 28 years believing that if I were just a little smarter, a little more successful, a little more like Ethan, their affection would finally turn to me. It was a fool's hope. Their love wasn't something to be earned. It was a resource, a strategic investment, and they had poured all of it into one portfolio. Later that night, the house finally settled into its museum-like stillness. I was in my room, tracing the spine of a book, when the silence was shattered. It wasn't a loud noise, but a violent one. The sound of a car door slamming shut with enough force to rattle the windows, followed by the front door being thrown open. Muffled, frantic voices rose from the foyer. My first thought was that there had been an accident. I crept out of my room, my feet silent on the thick Persian runner. The landing of the grand staircase offered a shadowy vantage point, a theater box from which I had witnessed so many family dramas unfold. Below, in the marble-floored entryway, stood Ethan. He was a wreck. His designer suit was rumpled, his face was pale and slick with sweat, and his hands were trembling. My parents were there, my mother clutching her silk robe, my father's face a thunderous mask of confusion and anger. I couldn't hear every word, but I didn't need to. I heard the fragments, the shards of a shattered life. Words like fraud, investigation, FBI. My blood ran cold. I pressed myself against the ornate balusters, melting deeper into the shadows. Ethan's voice, usually so confident and smooth, was ragged and broken. He confessed that Innovate, the shining beacon of our family's future, was a house of cards. He told them everything was a lie. The numbers he'd used to attract investors were fabricated. The revolutionary software he'd promised was a buggy, non-functional prototype. The millions of dollars in venture capital were gone, funneled into a lavish lifestyle and desperate attempts to cover his tracks. An audit had been triggered by a disgruntled employee, and now, the federal government was building a case against him. He wasn't just facing failure, he was facing prison. I waited for the explosion. I waited for my father's rage, for my mother's recriminations. I expected them to finally see the fatal flaws in their golden child, but the explosion never came. Instead, a different kind of horror unfolded. My father's first question wasn't about morality or why his son had done this. He demanded to know how much money was involved and who else knew about the investigation. My mother didn't weep for her son's corrupted soul. She let out a strangled sob for the impending social ruin. I heard her whisper about the house, the country club membership, the humiliation. She lamented the loss of their reputation, the precious, fragile thing they had spent a lifetime cultivating. Their panic was not for Ethan the person. It was for Ethan, the asset. And now, that asset was about to be seized. They moved into the study, their voices dropping to urgent, conspiratorial whispers. I followed, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I stood in the darkened hall, listening through the crack in the door. I heard them discussing lawyers, loopholes, and damage control. They spoke of the family name as if it were a fortress under siege. Then, the conversation took a turn that made the air freeze in my lungs. My father's voice was low and calculated. He spoke of the need for a narrative, a story to feed the investigators and the public. He said they needed someone to take the fall, a scapegoat to absorb the initial blow. My mother, her voice trembling, agreed. It had to be someone believable, she said. Someone on the inside of the company but naive enough to be manipulated. A minor player who could claim mismanagement, not criminal intent. My brother, in a rare moment of weakness, whispered that there was no one. Everyone senior knew too much. There was a long, chilling pause. I could picture the scene in my mind. The three of them, trapped in the amber light of the desk lamp, their faces etched with desperation. I held my breath, waiting. Then, I heard my father speak again. His voice devoid of all emotion. He said there was one other option. Someone in the family. Someone whose career was, in his words, insignificant. Someone who had nothing to lose. Someone who owed them. In the silence that followed, I felt their collective gaze, their collective thought, travel up through the floorboards, up the staircase, and into the darkness where I stood. They didn't have to say my name. In that moment, I understood. I was not the forgotten moon. I was the emergency sacrifice, kept in reserve for the day the sun threatened to burn out, and that day had just arrived. The short journey from the shadowy landing to my bedroom felt like crossing a frozen lake at night. The ice was thin, the darkness absolute, and with every step, I expected to plunge into the paralyzing water below. I closed my door, the soft click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The room, my only sanctuary in this house of mirrors, suddenly felt alien. The books lining the walls, my companions for so many years, seemed to mock me with their silent stories of other people's lives. The world outside my window, the familiar suburban landscape of manicured lawns and sleeping houses, looked like a painting of a life I was no longer a part of. I sank onto my bed, the sound of my own pulse thundering in my ears. Someone who owed them, someone insignificant. The words weren't just an insult, they were a verdict. A final, damning judgment on my entire existence. For a moment, a wild, hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. All those years I had spent trying to carve out a space for myself in this family, trying to make them see me, and all along, they had seen me perfectly. They saw me as a contingency plan, a break-in-case of emergency tool. My mind, a frantic archivist, began pulling files from the deep storage of my memory, searching for evidence, for a pattern I had refused to see. The flashbacks didn't come in a gentle wave of nostalgia. They came like shards of glass, each one sharp and painful. I was 10 years old, standing proudly beside my science fair project. I had spent months building a detailed model of the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem, complete with functioning water filters. I had won first place in the district. I remember running home, the blue ribbon clutched in my hand, my heart soaring with a pure, uncomplicated joy. My father had glanced at it, offered a distracted compliment that it was very clever, and then immediately turned his attention to the large, gaudy soccer trophy Ethan had brought home from a regional tournament. My project, my ribbon, was placed on a shelf in my room. Ethan's trophy was given the place of honor on the living room mantelpiece. A week later, when my mother decided to redecorate, she told me my project was taking up too much space and moved it to the attic. She had explained, with a patient smile, that they needed the mantle for things that represented the family's public face. Ethan's achievements were for display, mine were for storage. The memories kept coming, faster now. I was 17, a year from graduation, sitting with my parents in this very same study where they were now plotting my destruction. We were discussing college finances. They pulled out my college savings bond, a fund my grandparents had started for me when I was born. My father, with the calm authority of a surgeon performing a necessary amputation, explained that Ethan had a brilliant business idea, a bespoke sneaker company, and needed seed money. He told me that my bond would be a fantastic investment in the family's future. He had assured me I was smart enough to get scholarships, that a state school offered a perfectly adequate education, whereas Ethan's potential was limitless and needed to be nurtured immediately. I had watched, numb and powerless, as my future was liquidated to fund my brother's whim. The sneaker company failed within a year, but the money was never spoken of again. It was another sacrifice I was expected to make and then forget. A knock on my door jolted me back to the present. It was my father. His voice, stripped of all warmth, was a sterile instrument. He informed me that they needed to speak with me in the study. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. The walk down the grand staircase felt entirely different this time. I was no longer an unseen observer in the shadows. I was the condemned, walking toward the stage. Every step was a conscious effort. The portraits on the wall, all of Ethan at various triumphant stages of his life, seemed to watch me with smug indifference. The air in the house had changed. The earlier tension was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical resolve. They had a plan. I was the plan. I entered the study. The room was a mausoleum of my father's ambition. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound law books he never read, and a massive mahogany desk that served as his throne. The air was thick with the scent of his whiskey and their collective fear. My father stood behind the desk, a general in his command center. My mother was perched on the edge of a leather armchair, her hands twisted in her lap, her face a carefully composed mask of maternal concern. And Ethan was slumped in the other armchair, staring at the floor. He couldn't meet my gaze. He looked small and pathetic, a king stripped of his crown, waiting for someone else to fight his battle, my father began. He spoke in a low, measured tone, the same voice he used with his corporate clients. He laid out the situation not as a crime, but as an unfortunate business complication. He spoke of market pressures, of youthful overenthusiasm, of a series of regrettable errors. He never once used the words fraud or theft. He then transitioned seamlessly, talking about the family, about the legacy his grandfather had built and that he had maintained. He spoke of the importance of solidarity, of protecting what was theirs, of weathering the storm together. He was building a cage of words around me, and with each sentence, the bars grew closer. My mother took her cue. Her voice was laced with a synthetic sweetness that set my teeth on edge. She spoke of a mother's love, of the sacrifices she had made for both her children. She reminded me of all the things they had given me: this beautiful home, a fine education, a life free of hardship. Her words were meant to be a balm, but they felt like an invoice, a detailed accounting of a debt she was now here to collect. She recounted a story from our childhood, a time when Ethan had fallen from a tree and I had run for help. She praised my loyalty then, my instinct to protect my brother. She told me that this was the same situation, just on a larger scale. She was asking me, she said, to be that loyal little girl again. The memory she chose was so grotesquely ironic, I almost choked. I remembered that day. I hadn't just run for help. I had tried to warn Ethan not to climb so high. He had laughed at me, calling me a coward. When he fell and broke his arm, my parents had rushed to his side. After the hospital, after he was settled in his bed with ice cream and new video games, my father had taken me aside and sternly told me that I should have done more to stop him, that it was my responsibility as his sister to keep him safe. Even then, his recklessness had somehow become my failure. Finally, they got to the point. My father laid out their proposal with the dispassionate air of a chess player sacrificing a pawn to save his king. I would come forward. I would, with the guidance of their high-powered attorney, confess to financial mismanagement. I had recently been added to the company's board as a nominal member, a move I now realized was horrifyingly premeditated, and they would use that. They would paint me as an inexperienced but well-meaning sister who had tried to help her brother's company and made a terrible mess of it. He assured me that I wouldn't go to prison. Their lawyer was the best in the state. He spoke of a plea bargain, of fines and probation. A temporary setback, he called it. He explained that a criminal record would destroy Ethan's career, but for me, a historian, it would be a footnote, an unfortunate story that would eventually fade away. He said they would take care of everything: the legal fees, the fines. They would set me up in a comfortable apartment, provide a generous allowance until this was all over. It was presented not as a punishment, but as a sabbatical, a paid vacation from my insignificant life. For one wild, sickening moment, I actually considered it. A lifetime of conditioning washed over me, a tidal wave of wanting, needing. A small, pathetic voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe this was my chance. Maybe this was the grand gesture that would finally make them love me. If I sacrificed everything, would they finally see me? Would they finally be proud? I looked at Ethan, hoping to see a flicker of protest, a shred of decency. He just sat there, a hollow man, his gaze fixed on a loose thread on the expensive rug. He was going to let this happen. He was going to watch them feed me to the wolves to save his own skin. Then I looked at my parents. My father's eyes were chips of granite, cold and unyielding. My mother was watching me with a look of desperate, pleading expectation. And in their faces, I saw the final, brutal truth. They didn't want my love. They didn't want my loyalty. They wanted my life. They wanted to consume it, to burn it as fuel to keep their precious legacy alight. This sacrifice wouldn't earn me a place at the fire. It would simply turn me to ash. The memory that sealed my decision was not a grand betrayal, but a small, quiet one. My 21st birthday. A milestone. I had hoped for a small dinner, maybe a cake, but the date coincided with Ethan closing a minor deal for his startup. My parents flew to California to celebrate with him, forgetting my birthday entirely. They called me 2 days later, my mother's apology breezy and dismissive, telling me they had been so caught up in Ethan's success. I had spent my 21st birthday alone, eating takeout and watching old movies, feeling utterly and completely invisible. They had overlooked every milestone of my life, and now, they were asking me to surrender my entire future. The internal battle ended. The desperate child who wanted her parents' love died, and in her place, something cold and hard and clear took root. I straightened my back, the simple movement feeling monumental. I looked directly at my father, meeting his gaze for what felt like the first time in my life. I told them no. The word was quiet, almost a whisper, but it landed in the center of the room with the force of a bomb. For a second, there was pure, uncomprehending silence. It was as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. Then, the masks disintegrated. My father's face contorted with a rage that was terrifying in its intensity. He told me he wasn't asking. My mother's manufactured concern evaporated, replaced by a venomous sneer. She called me a selfish, ungrateful child, and asked how I could do this to them after everything they had done for me. I stood up. My legs were shaking, but my voice was steady. I told them that the answer was no. I would not be their sacrifice. I turned and walked out of the study, leaving them in the ruins of their monstrous plan. As I reached the front door, my father's voice boomed from behind me. He informed me that if I walked out that door, I was no longer his daughter. He told me I was on my own. I didn't turn back. I opened the door, stepped out into the cold Maryland night, and closed it gently behind me. The sound of the latch clicking into place was not an ending. It was a beginning. I was disowned. I was alone. And for the first time in my life, I was free. Freedom, I discovered, has a taste. It tastes like the stale, $5 coffee from a 24-hour gas station, the only warmth I could afford in the biting cold of a Baltimore November. My father had been brutally efficient. Within hours of my departure, my debit card was declined, my credit cards were canceled, and my access to our family's joint savings account, which held the entirety of my modest stipend from the university, was revoked. He hadn't just disowned me, he had financially executed me. My car, a graduation gift registered in his name, was now a ticking time bomb. I knew it was only a matter of days before he reported it stolen. It was my only shelter, my only possession of value, and my prison. The first week was a blur of managed panic. I slept in the back seat, curled under a thin blanket, waking with a crick in my neck and a film of condensation on the inside of the windows. I parked in the anonymous lots of suburban shopping centers and industrial parks, moving every few hours to avoid suspicion. I learned the geography of homelessness, where to find clean public restrooms, which libraries had free Wi-Fi without a membership card, and how to make a single convenience store hot dog last for 2 meals. The shame was a physical weight, a cloak I couldn't take off. Every time a police car cruised by, my heart seized with the fear of being questioned, of having my pathetic new reality exposed. The pain of their betrayal was no longer an abstract concept. It was a gnawing hunger in my stomach, a deep, aching chill in my bones. During the long, silent nights, my mind replayed the scene in the study over and over, each viewing more agonizing than the last. I saw my father's cold fury, my mother's reptilian switch from concern to contempt, and Ethan's spineless silence. I had given them my childhood, my future, my unquestioning love. In return, they had tried to offer me up as a blood sacrifice to the god of their reputation. The love I once felt for them curdled into something dark and corrosive. It was a grief so profound it felt like a physical illness. By the second week, my small reserve of cash was gone. I sold my laptop, my primary tool for my research, my window to the academic world, at a pawn shop for a fraction of its worth. The man behind the counter, with tired, indifferent eyes, had told me that without the original box, he couldn't give me much. I handed over the laptop and took the crumpled bills, feeling like I was selling a piece of my own soul. I used the money for gas and food, rationing every dollar. The low point came on a Tuesday. I was parked outside the Enoch Pratt Free Library, using their public Wi-Fi on my phone, my last link to the world. I was mindlessly scrolling through a local news site when I saw the headline, Baltimore's Innovate, a story of resilience and family leadership. My blood turned to ice. The article was a masterpiece of public relations propaganda. It featured a glossy photo of my father and Ethan, standing side by side in the Innovate office, smiling like titans of industry. The piece lauded my father's wise mentorship and Ethan's unflinching courage in navigating a challenging market adjustment. It spoke of a corporate restructuring and praised Ethan for making the tough but necessary decision to streamline operations for future growth. There was no mention of fraud, no hint of an investigation. It was a complete, audacious lie, printed for the entire city to see. But it was the final paragraph that shattered me. It mentioned, in passing, that the company had recently parted ways with a junior board member whose inexperience had led to several fiscal miscalculations. The statement assured readers that the issue had been handled internally and that Mr. Vance Sr. had personally righted the ship. They had done it. They had found their scapegoat. It wasn't me, but they had created one. They had pinned the crime on some phantom employee, erased the truth, and were now painting themselves as the heroes of the story. I sat in my car, the cold seeping through the floor, and I felt a rage so pure and white-hot it burned away my grief. The sorrow that had been paralyzing me for weeks began to harden, crystallizing into something else. It was no longer about pain. It was about justice. No, it was simpler than that. It was about revenge. They thought I was insignificant. They thought they had erased me. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. I am a historian. I am an archivist. My entire life has been dedicated to finding the truth buried in the details, to piecing together narratives from forgotten fragments. And they, in their arrogance, had left fragments everywhere. That night, I didn't sleep. I drove to a 24-hour diner, bought a coffee, and sat in a corner booth. With the last of my pawnshop money, I bought a cheap, prepaid burner phone and a stack of notebooks. The plan that began to form was not born of emotion, but of cold, meticulous logic. I couldn't go to the FBI. My story was unbelievable. The ramblings of a disowned, unstable daughter against a powerful, respected family. I needed to create a crack in their fortress from the outside. A crack so deep they couldn't possibly plaster over it. My target was not my family, not directly. It was their foundation. The investors Ethan had swindled. These were ruthless, powerful people who hated being lied to more than they hated losing money. I just needed to give them a reason to start digging. I remembered my brief ceremonial tenure on the Innovate board. I had been CC'd on dozens of quarterly reports and internal communications. At the time, they were just digital clutter. But now, my memory, trained to catalog and cross-reference, went to work. I recalled a name from an old email chain. Marcus Thorne, the former chief financial officer. He was a brilliant, prickly man who had argued with Ethan constantly. He had resigned abruptly about a year ago to pursue other opportunities, the corporate euphemism for being fired. I remembered Ethan complaining that Thorne was an old-school numbers guy who didn't understand his vision. I realize now, Thorne wasn't old school. He was honest. He must have seen the fraud and refused to be a part of it. He was the loose thread. The next day, I was back at the library. Using an encrypted browser on a public computer, I spent hours researching the lead investors in Innovate's last funding round. I found the name of the primary stakeholder, a venture capital firm run by a woman named Juliana Reed. Her online profile painted her as sharp, aggressive, and intolerant of failure. She was the perfect audience. I created an anonymous, untraceable email address. My hands were shaking, but my mind was perfectly clear. I began to type. I didn't write an emotional plea. I wrote a business memo. My subject line was simple, a due diligence question regarding Innovate. In the body of the email, I laid it out with chilling precision. I introduced myself as a concerned party with knowledge of the company's internal operations. I pointed to specific discrepancies between the public quarterly reports and the investor prospectus, using figures and dates I had dredged from my memory. Then, I delivered the payload. I suggested that for a true picture of the company's health, they should speak with Marcus Thorne, the former CFO. I wrote that they might find his reasons for departure illuminating. I ended the email with a single sentence, telling them to check the server logs for deleted files from the third quarter of last year. I hit send. And for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had just thrown a rock at a hornet's nest. I had no idea if it would work, but the act itself was a release. The feeling of powerlessness that had haunted me began to recede, replaced by the thrilling hum of agency. The next 3 days were agonizing. I obsessively checked the news. My burner phone, my only connection. Nothing. I began to fear my email had been dismissed as spam, a prank from a disgruntled employee. The despair started to creep back in, whispering that I was a fool for trying. Then, on Friday morning, it happened. My phone buzzed with a news alert. It wasn't a local story. It was from the Wall Street Journal. The headline read, "Innovate CEO Caroline Vance takes leave of absence as board launches internal probe amid investor concerns." I read the article, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the phone. It reported that Juliana Reed's firm had forced an emergency board meeting. It mentioned an anonymous tip that had raised serious questions about financial reporting. It stated that an independent forensic accounting firm had been hired to conduct a full audit. I leaned my head against the cold glass of my car window, a sound escaping my throat that was half sob, half laugh. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was no longer the only thing I felt. Beneath it, a new sensation was blooming. A fierce, triumphant satisfaction. It was the feeling of a perfectly placed chess move, the quiet click of a tumbler falling into place. They had built their legacy on a foundation of lies, propped up by my silence and my sacrifice. I had just taken a sledgehammer to the first pillar, and as I watched the morning light break over the grim Baltimore skyline, I knew with absolute certainty that I was just getting started. The Wall Street Journal article was not a victory. It was a declaration of war. It was the first tremor that signals the coming earthquake, and I knew my family's response would be swift and brutal. My anonymity was a flimsy shield. They would immediately suspect me, the disgruntled, disowned daughter. My father was a man who believed in scorched earth tactics. He wouldn't just defend, he would attack, and he would aim to obliterate. I needed to move faster, to be smarter, to be more ruthless than they ever imagined I could be. Living out of my car was no longer just a hardship, it was a tactical liability. I needed a base, a place to work where I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder. The last of my pawn shop money, supplemented by a few days of under-the-table work washing dishes at a greasy spoon diner, was barely enough for a week's rent at the cheapest, the most dilapidated motel on the outskirts of Baltimore. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and desperation, but it had a lock on the door, a wobbly desk, and most importantly, an internet connection. It was my war room. My first act of revenge had been a single, well-aimed shot in the dark. My next moves had to be a coordinated campaign designed to dismantle their empire piece by piece. My father's power was built on 2 pillars, his wealth and his reputation. I intended to bring both crashing down. As an archivist, I knew that every person, every corporation, has a paper trail. The secrets are always there, hidden in plain sight, in financial statements, public records, and forgotten digital footprints. My new life became a rigid routine of research and reconnaissance. By day, I was a ghost haunting the public records office at the city courthouse and the historical archives at the local university, places where my presence would seem unremarkable. By night, my motel room transformed into an intelligence hub. Pinned to the peeling wallpaper were printouts of corporate structures, financial timelines, and a web of names connected by lines of influence and obligation. It was a beautiful, terrible mosaic of my family's life. My father, Richard Vance, had built a boutique real estate development firm on the bones of his father's construction company. He presented himself as a pillar of the community, a patron of the arts, a man of unimpeachable integrity. I knew this was a carefully constructed facade. The first phase of my plan was to find the rot beneath the floorboards. I started with his signature project, the Renaissance Wharf, a luxury condominium development on Baltimore's waterfront that had cemented his status as a major player in the city. The project was hailed as a triumph of urban renewal. I remembered him boasting at dinner parties about his innovative use of municipal partnerships to get it done. That phrase was my starting point. Hours of sifting through city council meeting minutes and zoning variance requests from a decade ago yielded the first crack. I found a pattern. A series of seemingly insignificant zoning changes, all passed by a narrow margin, had been crucial for the project's profitability. And one city councilman, a man named Robert Henderson, had voted in my father's favor every single time. Henderson had retired from politics a few years later, citing a desire to spend more time with his family. A quick search of property records told a different story. 6 months after the final Renaissance Wharf vote, Henderson's wife had purchased a vacation home in Florida. The purchase was made through a Shell LLC, but the registered agent was a lawyer from my father's firm. It was sloppy, it was arrogant, and it was exactly the kind of evidence I needed. This was more complex than an anonymous email. I needed a credible messenger, someone the media couldn't ignore. My research led me to Sarah Jenkins, a freelance investigative journalist for a progressive online publication. She had a reputation for being a bulldog, with a specific interest in municipal corruption. She was perfect. Once again, I used an encrypted email and my burner phone. I didn't give her the entire story, just the breadcrumbs. I laid out the timeline of the zoning votes, provided the public record numbers, and gave her the name of the LLC that had purchased the Florida property. I presented it as a tip from a concerned city employee who feared reprisal. I told her that the real story wasn't just about one corrupt councilman, but about how the city's most prominent developers manipulated the system. I was baiting the hook with a bigger fish. I hit send and waited, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. While that fuse was burning, I turned my attention to my mother. Caroline Vance was the curator of the family's social standing. Her power lay in her position on the boards of Baltimore's most prestigious charities, most notably the Children's Heritage Foundation, a fundraising behemoth that hosted the city's premier society gala each year. Her role as chairperson gave her immense social capital. It was time to bankrupt her account. My mother's weakness was her vanity and her carelessness with money, as long as it wasn't her own. The foundation's public tax filings were a treasure trove. I spent 2 days in the library, cross-referencing their expense reports, and the pattern that emerged was sickening. The fundraising expenses were astronomical. I found invoices for event planning from a boutique firm that, after some digging, I discovered was owned by my mother's best friend. I found catering bills for board meetings that cost more than my entire year's university stipend. The most damning discovery was the annual gala. The venue, the caterers, the florists, they were all vendors who also worked my parents' lavish private parties, and their invoices to the charity were consistently 20 to 30% higher than the industry standard. It wasn't outright theft. It was a subtle, insidious grift, using a children's charity as her personal slush fund to subsidize her lifestyle and enrich her friends. This required a different approach. I couldn't go to a journalist without revealing my hand. I had to create dissent from within. I identified 2 members of the foundation's board who were not part of my mother's inner circle. A stern, old-money philanthropist and a self-made businesswoman known for her fiscal conservatism. I drafted 2 separate anonymous packages. Inside each, I placed copies of the suspicious invoices, the public tax filings with the inflated expenses highlighted, and a neatly typed cover letter. The letter was written from the perspective of a junior accountant at the foundation who was gravely concerned about potential mismanagement of donor funds and feared for their job if they came forward publicly. I urged them to demand a full, independent audit for the good of the foundation and the children it was meant to serve. I mailed the packages from 2 different post offices across town. A week later, both bombs detonated. Sarah Jenkins published a bombshell exposé titled "The Price of a Skyline: Did Development Dollars Buy City Hall?" It didn't mention my father by name initially, but it detailed the suspicious zoning votes, the retired councilman, and the Florida LLC. It was enough to launch a formal inquiry from the city's ethics commission. The story was picked up by the major local newspaper. My father's carefully polished reputation had its first deep, ugly scratch. 2 days after that, an internal email from the Children's Heritage Foundation was leaked to a society blogger. It was a terse announcement that the board had voted to postpone the annual gala pending a comprehensive financial review. The blog post buzzed with speculation. My mother's name was front and center. Her phone would be ringing off the hook, not with invitations, but with pointed questions from her so-called friends. The social pedestal she had spent a lifetime climbing had just been kicked out from under her. In my bleak motel room, surrounded by takeout containers and the architecture of my revenge, I felt a profound shift. The gnawing ache of my family's betrayal was still there, a phantom limb that would likely ache for the rest of my life. But the crushing weight of victimhood was gone. It was replaced by the clean, sharp, and intensely satisfying feeling of control. I was no longer the ghost in their machine. I was the operator, pulling the levers, watching the gears grind to a halt. They had underestimated me. They had seen a quiet, bookish girl. They had failed to see the archivist who knew that history, personal or public, is a weapon, and that the person who controls the narrative controls the past, present, and future. My phone buzzed. It was a news alert about Innovate. The internal probe had been completed. The findings were being handed over to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Criminal charges were now imminent. Ethan. It was time to deal with my brother. This part of the plan would not be anonymous. This would be personal. The news that federal charges were imminent for Innovate was the catalyst. It was the moment the ground beneath my family, already fractured by my anonymous attacks, finally gave way. Their carefully constructed world didn't collapse with a thunderous roar. It imploded with the quiet, sickening sound of shattering glass. And for the first time, I was close enough to hear every shard break. My revenge against Ethan had to be different. It couldn't be a press release or a leaked document. It had to be a mirror, one that forced him to look at his own reflection, stripped of the golden light my parents had always cast upon him. I knew he was weak. A hollow man propped up by ego and my father's money. The leave of absence was a fiction. I knew he was hiding at the family's secluded Chesapeake Bay house, a place we had spent summers as children, a place that now felt like a relic from another life. I drove there on a gray, overcast afternoon. The 2-hour drive was a journey back in time, each familiar landmark a ghost of a memory I now had to re-examine. I saw the ice cream shop where my father had once bought Ethan a double scoop for hitting a home run, while I, who had won the school spelling bee that same day, was told not to be greedy. I saw the marina where Ethan's sailboat, a lavish 16th birthday gift, was moored, while my own request for a simple kayak had been dismissed as impractical. Every memory was tainted, another piece of evidence of a lifetime of inequity. When I arrived, the house looked smaller, sadder. The manicured lawn was overgrown, the paint on the porch was peeling. It was a perfect metaphor for my family, beautiful from a distance, decaying up close. I didn't knock. I used the old spare key that was still hidden under a loose stone by the back door. An oversight. A testament to how completely they had erased me from their thoughts. I walked in. He was in the living room, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles, staring out at the churning gray water of the bay. He looked like a shipwrecked sailor. His usually perfect hair was a greasy mess, his designer clothes were rumpled, and a scruffy beard shadowed his gaunt face. When he saw me, he didn't look angry or surprised. He just looked tired, defeated. It was as if he had been expecting me all along. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting him truly see me. Not the adoring little sister, not the family doormat, but the architect of his ruin. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a hoarse whisper. He asked me if it was me. All of it. The investors, the probe. I didn't have to answer. He saw it in my eyes, a wave of something, not anger, but a kind of pathetic disbelief washed over his face. He told me he never thought I had it in me. He said it with a kind of bewildered admiration that was more insulting than any slur. He started to ramble, the words slurring together, fueled by alcohol and self-pity. He talked about the pressure, the expectations. He confessed that he had been lying about the company's success for years, that each lie required a bigger one to cover it. He spoke of our father, not as a mentor, but as a tyrant who demanded victory at any cost. He told me he was drowning and had been for a very long time. He was trying to make me feel sorry for him. A month ago, it might have worked. But the part of me that was capable of feeling sympathy for him had been carved out, cauterized. I told him I knew what it felt like to drown. I told him I had spent my entire life drowning in his shadow, gasping for a breath of my parents' affection while he soaked it all up. I recounted the night they had asked me to take the fall for him, my voice cold and precise. I described the taste of gas station coffee, the bone-deep cold of sleeping in my car, the humiliation of selling my laptop, my future, for a handful of dollars. For the first time, A flicker of genuine shame appeared in his eyes. He finally seemed to comprehend, not just the consequences for himself, but the reality of what had been done to me. I placed a small digital voice recorder on the coffee table between us. I told him he had one choice. He could go down with my father, clinging to the wreckage of their lies, or he could tell the truth. He could give the U.S. Attorney's Office a full confession, detailing not only his own fraud but my father's role in planning the cover-up and his attempt to coerce me into taking the blame. I told him it was called a proffer agreement. It might save him from a long prison sentence. It was his only way out. I left the recorder on the table and walked out without another word. As I drove away, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound and empty quiet. I had broken my brother. I had handed him a choice between two different kinds of damnation, and I knew which one he would choose. He would save himself. He always did. The fallout came quickly. Ethan's confession must have been a bombshell inside the prosecutor's office. The investigation, which had been focused on corporate fraud, now pivoted to include obstruction of justice and witness tampering. The target was no longer just Ethan, it was Richard Vance. I watched the subsequent implosion from the sterile anonymity of my motel room. The first sign was the for sale sign that appeared in front of my childhood home. A friend from my past life sent me a text, a screenshot from a real estate website. The asking price was shockingly low. They were liquidating, trying to raise money for a legal defense that was rapidly becoming unwinnable. Then came the news about my mother. The comprehensive financial review at the Children's Heritage Foundation had become a full-blown scandal. The story of her creative accounting had been leaked, I suspect, by one of the board members I had contacted, and the fallout was catastrophic. The city's elite, who valued nothing more than the appearance of propriety, shunned her completely. Her phone calls went unanswered. Her invitations were rescinded. She was declared a social pariah. I read a quote from a society blogger that described her as looking utterly lost at a grocery store, a ghost haunting the aisles she used to rule. My mother, who had once told me my passion was a little hobby, had just lost the only job she had ever truly cared about, being Mrs. Caroline Vance. She was stripped of her title, her purpose, her identity. The deepest cut, however, was reserved for my father. Sarah Jenkins, the investigative journalist, had followed the trail I had given her all the way to a conviction. The Ethics Commission's inquiry had turned into a criminal investigation. Councilman Henderson, facing his own legal jeopardy, had confessed, agreeing to testify against my father in exchange for immunity. The news broke on a Wednesday morning. Richard Vance, titan of industry and paragon of civic virtue, had been indicted on charges of bribery and conspiracy. I found a picture of him online, taken as he was leaving the courthouse after his arraignment. He looked 100 years old. The arrogant, commanding posture was gone, replaced by a defeated slump. His eyes, which had always been so cold and calculating, were hollow, filled with a bewildered shock. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the one who pulled the strings, the one who controlled the narrative. He was looking at a future where he had no power, no status. He was looking at a world he no longer recognized, because it was a world I had created for him. In my motel room, I felt a strange and unsettling calm. The fire of my rage had burned down to embers. The satisfaction I had felt was replaced by a vast, cold emptiness. I had won. I had systematically destroyed their lives, just as they had tried to destroy mine. I had watched them fall, one by one, into the pits they had dug for me. But as I looked at my own reflection in the motel's darkened television screen, I had to ask myself the question that had been lurking in the shadows of my mind. After the revenge is complete, what is left? The 6 months that followed the indictments were a quiet, gray purgatory. The legal machinery ground on with agonizing slowness, but the public spectacle was over. My family's name, once a symbol of Baltimore society, was now a byword for disgrace. I watched from a distance, a ghost observing the slow, methodical demolition of a house she used to live in. I had traded my motel room for a small, sparsely furnished apartment in a quiet, working-class neighborhood, a place where no one knew the name Vance. The rent was paid with the first installment of a book advance. A publisher, intrigued by the media storm, had reached out to Sarah Jenkins, who, in turn, had found her way to me. They wanted the story behind the story. They wanted to know about the anonymous archivist who had unearthed a city's secrets. My life found a new, quiet rhythm. I spent my days not in dusty archives, but in front of a blank screen, trying to weave the chaotic, painful threads of my past into a coherent narrative. Writing the book was a different kind of excavation. It forced me to look beyond the rage and the revenge, to examine the foundation upon which my family had been built. It was a foundation of transactional love, where affection was a commodity and children were investments. Ethan was the blue-chip stock they poured everything into, and I was the low-yield bond, kept in the portfolio for the sake of appearances, and ready to be liquidated in a crisis. The truth, I realized, was that their betrayal hadn't started in the study that fateful night. It had been a quiet, continuous act, perpetrated over 1,000 small moments of dismissal, comparison, and neglect. The demand for me to sacrifice my future for Ethan wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of their entire system of belief. They weren't just saving their son, they were protecting their primary asset. It was the most brutal business decision of their lives, and they had made it without a moment's hesitation. The final legal verdicts came in the early spring. Ethan, thanks to his full cooperation, received a sentence of 2 years in a minimum security federal prison and a massive fine. His testimony had been the key that unlocked everything. He had saved himself, just as I knew he would. My father was not so lucky. Convicted on both bribery and obstruction of justice charges, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The empire he had built was gone, his assets seized or sold off to pay for his legal defense. He had lost everything he valued: his money, his company, his reputation. His legacy was not one of civic pride, but of public shame. My mother was never charged with a crime. Her punishment was, perhaps, more insidious. Stripped of her social standing and her husband's wealth, she was left with nothing but herself, a person she had never taken the time to know. I heard through a distant family acquaintance that she had moved to a small, rented condo in Florida, not far from the vacation home that had been the first domino to fall. She was living a life of quiet, anonymous obscurity, the one fate she had always feared more than death. One day, a letter arrived at my publisher's office, forwarded to my new address. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, shaky. It was from Ethan, sent from his prison camp. It was not a letter asking for forgiveness. He knew he had no right. Instead, it was a confession. He wrote about our childhood from his perspective, admitting for the first time that he had always been aware of the disparity, of the invisible weight of their expectations on him and the crushing weight of their neglect on me. He confessed that my success had always terrified him because it was quiet, authentic, and earned, while his was a loud, hollow performance, funded by their ambition. He told me that in forcing him to confront the truth, I had, in a strange way, set him free. He ended the letter by saying he hoped one day to become a man who deserved to be my brother. I read the letter, folded it, and felt not satisfaction, but a quiet, aching sadness for the 2 children we had been, both trapped in different wings of the same gilded cage. I never heard from my parents again. Their silence was its own kind of verdict, a final, unyielding refusal to acknowledge their own monstrousness. There would be no deathbed confessions, no tearful reunions. Their pride was the last thing they had left, and they would cling to it until the end. I had to accept that the closure I sought would never come from them. It had to come from within. My book, titled The Archivist, was published a year after the verdicts. It wasn't just a tell-all about my family's crimes. It was a meditation on the quiet violence of emotional neglect and the power of truth to dismantle even the most formidable lies. To my astonishment, it resonated with people. I received letters from readers who saw their own stories reflected in mine, who had also lived in the shadow of a favored sibling or struggled against the crushing weight of parental expectation. I used the proceeds from the book to start a small foundation, one that bore no one's name but its own. We provided funding for grassroots historical preservation projects, the very kind of work my mother had once called a little hobby. We helped communities digitize their local histories, restore forgotten cemeteries, and record the oral histories of their elders. We gave voice to the voiceless, just as I had once tried to do. One cool autumn afternoon, I stood on the steps of the Baltimore Museum of History, where a new exhibit had just opened. It was Baltimore's Forgotten Legacy, a project I had personally curated, using the textile workers' diaries I had fought so hard to restore years ago. The exhibit was filled with the faded photographs and handwritten accounts of ordinary people whose lives had been erased by the grand narratives of industrial titans. As I watched families walk through the exhibit, listening to them read the words of the forgotten workers, I felt a sense of peace that revenge had never given me. My satisfaction no longer came from the sound of my family's world shattering, but from the quiet hum of this room, the sound of lost stories being found. My father was wrong. A legacy isn't something you build with steel and stone or hoard in stock portfolios. It isn't a name carved on a building. A true legacy is the story you leave behind. My family had left a story of greed, arrogance, and ruin. Theirs was a legacy of ashes. I had walked through that fire and emerged on the other side. My hands were not entirely clean. My heart was scarred, but it was unburdened. I had found my own story, not in their grand library, but in the margins they had never bothered to read. And in telling it, I had finally found my own voice.